for us is in the same way that Half-Life 2 was an attempt to take everything that we saw in the industry and all of our own thinking and our own experiences and turn it into sort of the definitive statement of what a first-person action game was. That's what Artifact is in terms of trading card games, right? You know, Richard really invented the modern trading card game with Magic the Gathering. He's learned a huge amount. We think we're contributing to this, and between us, that's what we're trying to do. You know, one of the interesting things about trading card games is they've been around for a long time. This is something people really like to do. It's not like, you know, this is an exclusively a recent phenomenon. You know, it's people have been doing this for hundreds of years. When you look at post Magic the Gathering, for us there are a couple of sort of interesting points along the way. Like as sort of designers and people who are thinking about customers, like Pokemon did this amazing job of doing some, still probably is the benchmark for saying, if you're trying to do a game, if you're trying to do a trading card game as well, if you're trying to do, you know, linear media, they really have done it better than anybody else. Like it is still the single most valuable entertainment franchise in history. You know, more than the Super Bowl, more than certainly any of Valve's products, more than Harry Potter. Pokemon is that. So that's, you know, why that's important. Chronex was interesting because it was the first it was the first digital online trading game. It's an answer to a trivia question, but it's kind of an important one to answer. Hearthstone is a great game. Right now, we would say that that's really the benchmark online trading card game. We think they do a lot of really smart things, and obviously, we've been fans of Blizzard and Blizzard products for a long time. So what is Artifact? It's a very deep game, right? When there's been a trade-off to be made between, oh, this requires us to write more code, or this requires us to build more art, or this means that we have to work a lot harder in terms of training materials, we've always optimized for making it a deep game. You know, in the same way that, like Dota can't be solved, right? There are choices that you make, and the choices have implications, and then the opposing player can be responding to that. There's no rock, paper, scissors. This doesn't beat this. It isn't guaranteed to beat this. And that's a characteristic of Artifact as well. We've taken also, you know, we've been shipping a bunch of esports titles, and this really takes all of our best thinking about how to build something that's great for tournaments and great for spectation, and then incorporates it into a trading card game. From a really high level perspective, we really want to stay away from pay to win. We think that actually is kind of has a pernicious impact on the design of the game and the evolution of the community over time. There are choices that we make. For example, the game is not free to play. I'll go into that in sort of an annoying amount of depth subsequently about why we think that makes sense. Another example is, you know, when you're in a free to play environment, you end up with this tendency that rarity equals power, right? So you're trying to create this artificial relationship, and that's not the case at all with Artifact. There are plenty of very common cards that are going to be super powerful. The whole point is to steer away from pay to win and that kind of approach. Sort of the core value, or the core, it's like one of the design trips, I guess is the right way to say it. So we always want to reward investment. You always want to feel like, as a player, that for each aspect of Artifact, the more time you spend on it, that you're getting better at it and that you're enjoying it more. We've all played plenty of games where you put in 100 hours and you really are done, right? You know, if you played another 100 hours, you're still going to be playing it pretty much the same way you were at that point. You're not really feeling like you're improving. You don't feel like you're being rewarded for the time and effort that you're putting into it. So I use Dota because I think most of you have played Dota. So in my case, I put in over 10,000 hours of Dota, and I'm still convincing myself, although some people around here may disagree, I'm still convincing myself that I'm becoming a better player. Like right now, I'm obsessed with a single aspect, which is when I play, I'm super focused on denies, right? You know, and that's just one of those things that as a Dota player you do. It's like you loop back, right? I remember, you know, 9,950 hours ago when I started trying to figure out how to do denies. But now I've like circled back again, and I'm really convinced that if I can get a little bit better, that it's going to have an impact, and that my enjoyment of the game and my skill in the game are going to get better. That's the same thing we're trying to achieve with Artifact. If you're into deck building, you're going to feel like depth building has enormous depth, right? That there are a bunch of interesting choices you can make. It's not like everybody just automatically is going to know what the correct answer is. You're going to feel like, wow, I actually learned something, or I watched somebody else build a deck, or I tried some stuff. My deck building is getting better. You're going to want to feel like you're going to be rewarded for actually searching for, the marketplace for deals and things that you're interested in. Playing it, studying it, watching it are all things that are going to reward you to the degree that you put that in. So that's an important characteristic. And hopefully after you have a chance to play and after you have a chance to see the pros play, you'll start to get a sense of how that's actually instantiated in the game. Has high production values. I'll talk about this a little bit more, but it uses the Source 2 engine, which probably sounds like it's a little overpowered for a card game, but I think when you see the game, you'll realize how that translates. The only single player component to it is there's an AI that's going to teach you how to play the game, right? There's no campaign. It's not intended to be a single player game at all, other than to prepare you for multiplayer. It has a bunch of novel mechanics, things that just haven't been seen in trading card games before. Like, there's stuff in there that Magic the Gathering player will look at and go, oh my God, that breaks a whole bunch of stuff in my model for how this stuff works. There are going to be a bunch of consequences. There are going to be a bunch of choices I make. There are going to be a bunch of strategies that are affected by these kinds of mechanics. You see that as you play. We think a lot about economy. So when we talk about packs, what we're really talking about is users injecting value into the shared economy that everybody has. And so I'll talk about that, where the process of doing that is supposed to be have benefits above and beyond just the fact that you end up with a bunch of cards. It has to be something that your purchase of cards makes other players' lives better. As I said before, deck building is in and of itself a significant experience. So economy, marketplace, and workshop, we'll talk about that more, as well as the fact that it's much you can play. So, talking with Richard, so the original Magic the Gathering players typically were spending about $400 a year on cards, right? That's just kind of a concrete number. So when you think of the fact that people are acquiring assets, right? You start to worry when you think of these things the way we've learned to think about them. How do you preserve that value, right? You don't want people to say, I've accumulated a bunch of assets and they're constantly being depreciated. I don't want to find out that the cards have gone to zero value because of some design decision you've made, or because I can't exchange them for other people. So a market is one way of increasing the value of an asset. In nerdy terms, there's a liquidity premium that are associated with that assets. One of the weird things, for me personally, and this is maybe me being a little bit naive, is I was surprised that paper games had much better liquidity characteristics than the digital card games, because it's actually a lot easier, obviously, to create online digital exchanges of those things. But in a lot of these games, it was easier in the paper world to buy and sell cards and maintain the value of the assets that you had acquired. So let's turn this into a kind of a concrete example. Here's an example of a long-term side effect. If it's difficult for you to exchange the value, to exchange assets for other similarly valued assets, what you end up happening is you're imposing a huge switching cost on strategy. So let's say in a game where either my assets are depreciating or I can't exchange them, I can spend a bunch of time building up stuff, and then I'm stuck with my strategy. Like, I can't make a technical decision and say, I would like to try something else, because essentially I have to burn all of the value that I've put into the game so far, right? So what you want to do, okay, why is that bad? Well, it's bad because it means that there's this, you end up getting the characteristic that you see in games with those qualities is that there's a stagnation in the evolution of strategies. You also end up having people who just reach the point where they fall off a cliff and just aren't gonna make they're just going to keep playing, they're going to get bored, and then they're going to stop playing. So it has kind of a toxic effect in the long run. One of the reasons we're not free to play is that if there's a drain where essentially time, there's not, if there anything has a value of 0 and there's any connection to any of the other assets, it drives down all of those other assets to 0 as well. So if time is free, or if an account is free, or cards are free, then anything that has a mathematical relationship to those things ends up becoming devalued over time, whether it's the player's time and you just make people grind for thousands of hours for minor or trivial improvements, or the asset values of the cards or whatever. That's a consequence. So you don't want to create that flood of free stuff that destroys the economy and the value of people's times and assets. So I'm avoiding talking about the game because this is all background stuff for when you actually see the game. So we do think tournaments and spectation are going to be super important. We're going to start off by having, similar to the original international that we did for Dota, there's going to be $1 million tournament that will actually happen Q1 of next year. There are also going to be automated tournaments. So the system will automatically build tournaments where it's trying to figure out how to create the most entertainment value for groups. So it'll look through the space of players and try to create tournaments that pull people in so they're actually getting the greatest aggregate value out of that. There'll also be professional tournament tracks the same way that you see professional tournament tracks in TF and CS and Dota. And the spectation in the client should be very high quality. So there'll be, you have sort of the baseline Twitch stream where you're just looking at the same thing that the player is saying, and that's fine for people who want to do it that way. But we think that spectation is a lot more interesting, especially as the pros evolve their strategies. There's a bunch of live stats. You as the observer want to flip through both players' desks. Rather than just having the vision of an individual player, there are a bunch of things that make spectation a lot more interesting than just seeing what each player is seeing. As I said about packs, an economist would say that you need to have positive externalities, not just red extraction. So it's a spectatable event, and they're also like specific game modes. You guys are familiar with like draft and seal deck tournaments. Right, so those kinds of concepts are embedded in our thinking about the packs. And an important thing is that the more the community puts into the assets that they're accumulating, that then feeds into things like the compendium does in Dota 2, where if people buy a bunch of packs, that translates to a bigger tournament pools or other ways in which revenue gets fed back to the community. As I said before, Artifact uses Source 2. The interesting thing about that is it also means that now that Source 2 is running on iOS and Android. So it's kind of cool. It's just kind of a milestone for us in terms of, okay, well, you can actually run Dota 2 on an iPad right now. You wouldn't want to because the input is wrong and the performance isn't there. But that is kind of a cool milestone in terms of Source 2's development that we're running on those devices now. Now, Artifact uses the Dota 2 world, but it's important to understand the requirement for for Artifact was to build the best possible card game, right? It wasn't to build a Dota 2 card game. Right? The Dota 2 teams didn't say, oh, look, everybody else, they've got card games, we should have one too. The Artifact team was like, let's go build the best card game. And they said, out of the available IPs that we have, which one is most appropriate? We could use Half-Life, we could use TF, we could create our own. And the answer was that the Dota 2 IP actually had a bunch of characteristics and a bunch of lore and a bunch of community value that made it really attractive to use. And Artifact will be sort of at the same level of Dota 2 in terms of evolving that. So, a bunch of the storytelling, a bunch of the lore about that world is going to come in Artifact. there'll be plenty of cases, and you'll actually see some new heroes in Artifact today that will actually end up going back into Dota 2. So it's not like one is the leader and the other is the follower. They're both sort of equal participants in that world.
Something you considered a CS:GO card game?
We're not building a Dota 2 card game, right? We're building a card game, and CS:GO doesn't. I mean, you could probably build a card game that uses some of that, but you'd be building a very. It isn't clear to me that it would be a very interesting card game. So the key is, the first thing to do is to figure out how to build a cool card game. It's not to say, oh, we have these properties, let's build card games for each of them, right? It's, that wouldn't be super interesting. It's not free to play. It's not a paper game, so there's not going to be a paper version of it. You'll see when you're playing. There are plenty of cases where you'll end up in situations where it would just be really, really difficult to do a paper version of what we can do with a game, right? You can end up with 100 units in a lane, and you're just not going to do a paper game that has those kinds of characteristics. There's a bunch of interesting state and abilities that would be difficult to keep track of, and it's so we decided fairly early on that was a constraint that we would relax. We wouldn't try to figure out how to build something that was also a paper game. As I said before, there's no single player campaign. We're not trying to build something that is for one person. It's always something that you're going to be playing with other people. The reason that I'm doing this is it's interesting if you're trying to understand how we think about this, it's interesting to know both what we think and how we're setting it out, but also what we're not, right? It's like we're doing this, but we're not doing this. It sort of helps clarify, what our decision-making process is. Like a TV show, we think Pokemon's awesome, right? We think that there's some really clever stuff that they did. We think that the TV show is an important part of that. We're not trying to do that, right? In that specific case, we think that would be a fine thing to go do, but that's an example of something that we're not doing. In addition to what Artifact is not, there are other things which Artifact is not yet, right? So we know that these are things we know we need to do and we will do, but we just won't do them in the first release. It's not a moddable platform. I mean, if you look at what Artifact represents, it's a really powerful set of tools, and mod makers will be able to do all sorts of crazy stuff. Like a mod maker could absolutely go and build a Counter-Strike version or I was going to say something snarky, but you could go and build lots of cool mods. I personally want the Klondike mod, but I've been told I will have to wait. Illustrators are going to love the workshop, but there's not a lot of room for people to be contributing user-generated content beyond illustration. That we see, that is not a goal. That's an accident of scheduling, right? We think there are lots of ways. Illustrators are going to love it. They're going to be able to find lots of people who are going to love getting custom versions or special versions of cards, but all of the other ways that people in the workshop can create, like interesting animations for the imps or new character designs and things like that. That's going to be something that's going to happen subsequently to the initial release. We're in a closed beta right now. We'll have a public launch before the year. We'll have the $1 million tournament that'll just sort of help organize a bunch of our activities and community activities building up to that tournament. And then the mobile versions, the iOS and Android versions, will release mid next year. So I haven't shown you a single screenshot of the game. I've told you about none of the game mechanics. I've just told you the thinking that's gone into it. So now I think it would be really useful